The following is a production of Professor Robert Barnwell. Each episode includes insights provided by the chairman, CEOs, and CFOs of the world's most successful corporations, as well as thought leaders from premier business schools and international consultancies. If you and your team would like more information on corporate leadership and strategic management, or would like to learn more about Professor Barnwell, his research, and how he may be able to assist your company, please visit Professor Barnwell's website at robertgbarnwell.com.
Hello and welcome to CFO Talk Radio. I'm your host, Robert Barnwell. During the last episode, we spoke with William Sealer, the Ronald Edwin Szynski Professor in Business Administration at the University of Virginia's highly regarded Darden School of Business, about the thoughts and suggestions contained within his book, Financial Turnarounds, Preserving Enterprise Value, which he co-authored along with Henry Davis. This is episode 17, and we'll be speaking with consultant Paul Niven, the author of the powerful Balanced Scorecards Step-By-Step, Maximizing Performance and Maintaining Results. Paul, welcome to CFO and CEO Talk Radio.
Thank you, Robert. It's a pleasure to be here.
You know, I guess I first read your book shortly after its release, and as I think about it, I think I had the pleasure of being one of the very first people to review it on Amazon.com, and I've got it sitting on my desk now, and if I had to guess, I'd say about 10% of the pages in my copy are either flagged with little red or blue stickies, or they've got extensive highlighting and comments jotted in the margins. So obviously, I'm a huge fan of the book. But to give listeners a little context, your first edition came out almost 10 years to the day, I think, after Robert Kaplan and David Norton's seminal Harvard Business Review article really introduced the world to the balanced scorecard concept, and then more than 5 years after Kaplan and Norton's book, The Balanced Scorecard, was eventually published by HBS Press. So, you know, really, given the success of Kaplan and Norton's work, what more did you think needed to be said on the topic, and why do you think it's been so well received?
Sure. First of all, it sounds like you and I have something in common, that we both like to mark up our books. So that's good to hear that. I'm a compulsive book note-taker as well. Let me give some background on the balanced scorecard for listeners that aren't as familiar as you and I on the system. You mentioned it was developed by Robert Kaplan and David Norton, and it goes back to around 1990, as you had mentioned. And they really were examining performance measurement frameworks or management frameworks for the 21st century through the lens of challenges that organizations face. And they really narrowed it down to three fundamental challenges that all organizations, whether you're public, private, nonprofit, large, small, face. And those were an over-reliance on financial measures, because historically, as you know, the measurement and management of business has been primarily financial. And they realized that in the 21st century that we probably need other indicators of success. A second challenge they examined was the rise of intangible assets. Of course, even going back then, and it's more prevalent today, we hear about the importance of human capital and leveraging intangible assets to drive strategic value for our customers and our stakeholders. And so they were wondering, how can we develop a performance measurement or management framework that really allows us to identify the strategic assets we need to drive our strategy and track them over time to make sure we're exploiting them to full advantage. So they examined that. The third lens, if you will, that they looked at was the difficulty of executing strategy. And they discovered, and this is actually a well-known fact, the vast majority of organizations do not effectively execute their strategy. And that was the big issue that they had to solve. And their basic hypothesis, and really the birth of the balanced scorecard, can be traced to a belief that in order to execute strategy, we should measure it. And so they simply said, let's take a strategy and let's translate it into measures using four distinct but related perspectives of performance. So they said all companies, when trying to execute their strategy and measure it, should look at a financial perspective. If we're going to successfully execute our strategy, what does that mean we need to do well financially? Does it mean that we're going to be very efficient, cost-effective, or we're going to have double-digit returns on revenue? What is it financially? Of course, looking at a customer perspective is really the essence of any strategy. And so here they really suggested organizations measure their ability to first identify their target customers, determine what their customers demand or expect from them, and measure their ability to achieve that. And of course, also measure their ability to deliver on a value proposition. whether that was cost leadership or product innovation or customer intimacy. The third perspective of performance was internal processes, where they suggested that organizations measure their strategy by looking within and asking themselves, what do we need to do really well internally as a company to drive value for our customers? And lastly, and this was an important innovation, they suggested that organizations also measure their performance from what they called a learning and growth perspective. And this is where they were able to tie in those intangible assets. So they challenged organizations to say, what are the intangible assets we need to drive our strategy? So what human skills do we need? What competencies or talents do we need from our people to execute our strategy? What about information technology? Of course, IT drives all organizations today. What are the IT underpinnings that we really need to drive success in our strategy? So that's the kind of the balanced scorecard model at 30,000 feet, if you will. And you'd asked me about my books, and when Kaplan and Norton wrote their books, they were really mainly talking about the theory of the balanced scorecard, and that was tremendously helpful to people. But I got my start in this work as a practitioner. I worked for an organization that was an early adopter of balanced scorecard, and we loved the theory, we loved what it espoused, but when it came time to actually implement, there was a gap. And so, of course, we made virtually every mistake in the book you could, but ultimately we were very successful, and that helped me learn some of the major lessons in what it takes to successfully implement a balanced scorecard. And so I realized, obviously, that I wasn't alone here. If we were struggling with this, probably other organizations were as well. So my goal in writing my first book was to just kind of fill that gap or bridge that gap, if you will, between theory and practice. And I think for a lot of organizations, what they were struggling with was the change aspects of this. You know, how do we make sure our executive sponsors are on board for this? How do we ensure we have a guiding rationale for why we're developing a balanced scorecard? How do we bring people on board? How do we communicate effectively and train them? And so I really focused on the softer side of the balanced scorecard, and I think that's why the book has remained successful. My first one has now been translated into 15 languages, which tells me that this is a global phenomenon. And all organizations, while they may respect and love the theory, they need insights onto what it takes to actually implement. And so I think my books have really helped bridge that divide.
Yeah, I think so. And if I remember correctly, my Amazon.com feedback for your book was something along the lines of, this is the book that Kaplan and Norton wished they had written. But I should point out that Robert Kaplan was kind enough to write the foreword to this book, so there's no competition between the two.
No, he was extremely kind to do that, yeah.
Yeah. Now, perhaps I should save this question or comment rather for Professor Kaplan, but in his absence, I'll give you an opportunity to share your own thoughts. But essentially, I'm a little uncomfortable with the word balanced in the term balanced scorecard. And here's where I'm coming from. Although I'd agree that a performance measurement system should incorporate financial, internal business process, customer, and human resource measures, I'd say that some of these categories are more important than others depending on the individual business and the nature of the industry that they compete in. And let me give an example. If I'm looking at a large consulting firm, the learning and growth measures would likely be far more important and strategic in terms of the company's competitive position and future success than it would, say, for a highly automated manufacturer of, say, low-tech widgets. So I guess the question disguised in my comment or observation is, does the term balanced scorecard suggest that the system should feature an equal number of measures, all with relatively equal importance across each of these measurement categories, irrespective of the nature of the business, its industry, and its strategy?
That's a great question. And let's talk about what the word balance connotes in the balanced scorecard. We're really talking about balance between three things. Balance between short-term and long-term indicators. There's some things on your scorecard that you can measure every day if you'd like. But there are other things, for example, new product development, innovation, that takes a longer time, so we have that balance. we have the balance between internal and external constituents, if you will. We're looking at employees or how we employ technology. Those are internal processes as well. Externally, of course, primarily we're looking at customers and how we drive value for them. So we have that balance. And lastly, what I think you're focusing on here, and mainly in your question, we have that balance between financial and non-financial indicators of success on which the entire balance scorecard is predicated. So as for how technically balanced a balanced scorecard should be, I'm actually inclined to agree with you that it should be modified to meet the unique needs of each organization. I think what people have to keep in mind is the balanced scorecard at its core is a tool for executing strategy. And as you rightly point out, organizations are going to pursue different strategies to secure market dominance and financial success, of course. And I think the scorecard should reflect those strategic priorities. Your example of a consulting firm is a great one when we think about them. Of course, they're going to rely very heavily on those intangible assets, such as knowledge of their consultants and the ability to share that knowledge and build on it in future engagements. So therefore, we'd expect to see a heavily populated learning and growth perspective for them, identifying, again, the intangible assets, whether human capital, information capital, they need to drive their strategy. But I think other perspectives of performance are going to be still vital for them. In the consulting company case, we'd expect investments made in people and enabling technology in that learning and growth perspective to drive results in their internal process perspective. That could be the ability to generate new solutions for clients and perhaps do so that even faster and more efficiently, thereby reducing costs for the company itself. And this, in turn, of course, should drive client outcomes. In the customer perspective, very simply, we'd expect to see customer satisfaction scores increase because the consulting company now has improved their processes because they have the right people and the right technology to drive that success. And then lastly, of course, we want to see all of this kind of manifest itself in improved financial results that we're measuring in the financial perspective because ultimately we want to demonstrate that the strategy is, in fact, effective. So, bottom line, I agree with you that the balanced scorecard should reflect the strategic priorities of the organization, but it's important not to neglect any of the strategic perspectives. And I also think that, depending on the life cycle of your business, whether you're a new business, of course, that you're very focused on driving revenue, you might have, extra measures in your financial perspective. If you're a more mature company where you're harvesting, you would expect to see a different mix of measures. But again, the basic tenet of balanced scorecard is balance. That doesn't mean 25% in each perspective, but it does mean that we're examining all four of those perspectives to make sure that we're actually translating our strategy into each one to tell a coherent story.
Great. Well, I think like you, Paul, my academic and professional focus is largely on strategy execution and performance improvement. And I'd really be at a loss to suggest a stronger tool within either of these two fields than a properly aligned performance dashboard, such as the balanced scorecard. If you would, could you take us through the role of the company's mission, values, vision, and strategy in developing a business scorecard?
I'd be happy to. And I think it's important that you bring those terms up, Robert, because they really lead to a lot of confusion for a lot of organizations, don't they? And they end up being the butt of a lot of jokes and Dilbert cartoons, that sort of thing, because people get these terms mixed up. But I think, what's important for organizations is not to follow my definition or your definition necessarily, but to follow a consistent definition. I've seen that, again, I'm primarily a practitioner and a consultant, and so I try to focus on what works. I'm not looking for the right definition, but I'm looking for a definition that works for organizations. And what I've seen to be really toxic is when organizations look at these terms and one person defines the mission as one way and another person defines it another way, and they spread that to the people, and of course you get conflicting messages, and that's where of course people become skeptical about this. So the first thing I think you have to do, and one of the first things I suggest to my clients, is to develop if you will, a performance management dictionary. What do these terms mean to you? Very simply, very briefly, for me, the mission is the core purpose of the organization, why it exists beyond just making money if it's a for-profit organization. Why is it that employees engage in the organization's work day in and day out? That's the mission, the calling. The values are the shared principles or beliefs that are cultivated over many years from decisions made on everything from who they hire to the technology that they deploy, et cetera, shared beliefs and those core beliefs. The vision, to me, is a word picture of what the organization intends to become, maybe 5, 10 years down the road, but where the mission can be somewhat inspirational and a little more abstract. We want our vision to be more concrete and verifiable, so that maybe within 10 years we'll be the leader in our industry, having 10,000 stores. But again, concrete and verifiable. And finally, the last piece in the puzzle for me before we get to a balanced scorecard is the word strategy. And gosh, we could spend all day talking about how do you define strategy. For me, I define it as the broad priorities adopted by an organization in recognition of their operating environment and in pursuit of their mission and their vision. So, and when I talk about those broad priorities, I'm talking about what their driving force is, what their customer value proposition is, and what markets they choose to serve. So those are my definitions, and they're really vital for a balanced scorecard, because balanced scorecard is really about translation. Yeah, and we want the objectives and the measures we use to track our success every single day to really be consistent, of course, with our mission, our values, our vision, and our strategy. So when I'm working with my clients and when I'm looking at what others have developed, I always look for that link. Have the measures they developed, can we trace a clear path right back to their mission, so that we know that when they're making decisions on a day-to-day basis, when they're tracking performance, it's consistent with where they want to go ultimately as an organization. And I think it's a very important tool for managers to keep in mind as well. When you have to make strategic decisions and you have to make sometimes difficult decisions that people don't like, if you've aligned your performance measurement system with your vision and your values, it gives you a stronger rationale for explaining your choices. You can share with your team that, well, I know these are difficult times, these are difficult decisions, but in light of where we want to go as an organization, our core purpose, where we want to get to with our vision, these are some of the difficult pills we have to swallow now. So it really allows organizations a good way to provide a rationale for their ongoing decision making.
Now, I appreciate you taking the time to really put the mission, values, and vision in particular into some sort of context, because really the reality is a lot of companies, these things are a bit nefarious, and
yes.
They take them out of, I guess the equivalent that I could think of is a high school pep rally. And you think, these are getting us really excited and motivated, but really, when it comes to substance, there's not a lot here. And I think that your definition adds that substance and practicality, and gives us all a taste of why they're so important when we go to set our balanced scorecard.
Absolutely.
So having incorporated the company's mission, values, vision, and strategy, you also suggest giving particular consideration for each company's performance objectives, as well as the individual cause and effect linkages between various measures and the activities correlated to these objectives. What does this entail, and what are some of the keys to success in this process?
Right. One of the reasons I love the balanced scorecard and working in this arena so much is that the tool has really evolved over time, and I think that's important because as practitioners, we've learned how to harness the power of the balanced scorecard more effectively. And naturally, I think as a result, my views, and I'm sure in some cases yours have as well, have changed over time. And this is one of the areas where I see my views evolving a little bit, even from what are in my original books. Now, what I'm talking specifically about is the idea of cause and effect. In Kaplan and Norton's earliest writings, and to some extent still today, they talk about creating a chain of cause and effect linkages through measurement in your balanced scorecard to tell what they call a strategic story. So very, very simply, it might work like this. It's usually a series of if-then statements. If we invest in employee capabilities, giving them the skills they need to succeed, that will improve our ability to drive better processes, and maybe better quality or better throughput, better time. If we improve our processes, then our customers will be happier and more satisfied because, again, we're being a more efficient, effective organization. And if, of course, we have happy customers, they'll buy more and it will improve our financial returns. That's extremely simplistic, but that's what they were suggesting organizations attempt to do in cultivating their balanced scorecard systems. Tell a strategic story. And in my initial writings, in the book, from reading it, I suggest that as well. But over time, I've learned that it's very, very difficult statistically, as you know, to isolate pure cause and effect relationships, especially when we're talking about something that can be as nebulous as a strategy and strategy execution. How do we pinpoint a direct causal relationship between two variables? I think you can obviously talk about correlation. We can see that things move together in unison. But actually pinpointing causation, I think, is more difficult. So what I focus on now, Robert, with my clients is taking the strategy and translating it into a set of objectives and measures and targets they feel they really need to excel at in order to drive results for the company, in order to bring that strategy to life. I'm not so much concerned that they link them together to tell that story at this point. What I want, again, is a good set of measures that primarily they can discuss as a management team and learn about. So learn about the strategy and then ask the right questions. And I think you're probably well aware of the famous Peter Drucker quote, the quote that suggests management spend too much time looking for the right answers when they should be looking for the right questions. And I think if we can develop a good set of performance measures, what that can lead to is better questions. Why is this happening? And what are the effects of the decisions we're making in this area? So that's really my primary focus now, in finding the right measures and not so worried about the cause and effect linkages.
All right. Well, many companies, unfortunately, have really failed to achieve the payoff that they had anticipated when they first developed their balanced scorecards. And in my own experience, I say that this disappointment often reflects a failure, with regard to the company's management, to really cascade the measures down throughout the organization and to use the balanced scorecard and these cascade measures on which to base promotion incentive compensation. Do you agree with this observation? And what else would you say, contributes, to these companies who've failed to achieve the results that they might have otherwise rightfully expected?
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right in identifying a lack of cascading as a key aspect of why many organizations don't experience the results they expect from the balanced scorecard. And of course, when we talk about cascading, what we mean is developing performance measures at ever lower levels of the organization so that we can demonstrate how each and every person contributes to overall strategic success. And Kaplan and Norton developed something several years ago they call the Balanced Scorecard Hall of Fame, where they look at organizations that have achieved tremendous benefits from the balanced scorecard, whether it's breakthrough financial results or tremendous results for their stakeholders if it's a nonprofit or public sector organization. And in examining the successful organizations, and of course this is available to all of us who study this, what they've isolated, and I agree 100% with, is that the single biggest differentiator in balanced scorecard success is, as you rightly point out, this idea of generating alignment. So it's one thing to develop the right set of performance measures that we can track at the corporate or highest level, if you will. But to really bring strategy to life, we need everybody in the organization to say, this is how I fit in, this is how I can contribute. There have been a lot of polls done by Harris Interactive and Gallup, of course, and they reveal the fact that a lot of employees don't know where the company is going and how they fit in. And this idea of cascading performance measures is a tremendous way to overcome that. So you're right. But you'd also asked if I see any other issues in organizations not always achieving the results they expect from scorecards. And I do. I guess at the base of your question, we could really boil it down to, is the balanced scorecard itself somehow flawed, or is it the implementation practices of organizations that are not achieving success? And of course, I think it's implementation practices, and there are three in particular that I would highlight. The first is the lack of a guiding rationale for the scorecard. So many organizations, when they call me, and I'll ask them, why are you developing a balanced scorecard? Of course, I'm curious, and sometimes I'll hear, well, it's we want to go from good to great, or it's time we did this, take the next step. And those aren't really guiding rationales, or more slogans, if you will, or themes. I think to make a balanced scorecard or anything work, whether we're talking lean or Six Sigma, anything, you have to know, why are we doing this? What is the specific business need this is solving right now? Is it a change in strategic direction? Is it the harnessing of new and important human capital that's going to drive our strategy? Why do we think the scorecard will help us? I think the second thing organizations really have to keep in mind is the idea of executive sponsorship. So if you're a leader in an organization, maybe you're listening to this interview today and you think, I like some of these ideas, I'd like to pursue a balanced scorecard. You as a leader, as the old saying goes, have to really walk the walk with balanced scorecard. So if you're someone who's typically managed primarily by financial measures, you've got to be willing to give that over to look at the total spectrum of performance. Because, of course, one thing that employees can spot faster than anything else is inconsistency with words and actions. So I think we need strong leaders who truly believe in the system to bring to life. And one last thing I could talk about is communication. Again, at its core, I think the balanced scorecard is primarily about change. A change in the way we measure, a change in the way we manage, and change is difficult for a lot of organizations. And so I think it's important to keep in mind that we need to communicate. And there's an old change axiom that we're all aware of, the WIFM, W-I-I-F-M, what's in it for me? We need to answer that question for our employee base. Again, why are we training to a balanced scorecard system? So how can our communication tools help us answer that question? I think, Robert, if organizations can effectively answer those three questions, they're on the road to a very powerful balanced scorecard system.
Oh, that's terrific. Now, unless I'm mistaken, next year marks the 10th anniversary of the initial publication of your book. And in the 10 years since the book first appeared, I think you alluded to this previously, but how has the balanced scorecard evolved? And in what ways do you expect that the balanced scorecard will continue to evolve in the coming years?
Oh, great question. You're right, it's coming up in 10 years. I can't believe it, since my first book came out. And when that book came out, and if you were to speak to Robert Kaplan or David Norton, I think they would tell you that they were primarily trying to solve a measurement problem. How do we overcome that exclusive reliance on financial measures? And the balanced scorecard fit the bill beautifully, but we saw a lot of organizations using it different ways. One of the biggest evolutions in the tool was the advent of strategy maps. One-page graphic representations of what an organization needs to do well to execute their strategy. And that was a big breakthrough for the balanced scorecard. Then we saw organizations linking the balanced scorecard to key processes, as you mentioned, incentive compensation, of course, cascading it, capital budgeting. And so we saw the balanced scorecard really emerge as a true strategic management system or framework. And so it has evolved tremendously in the 10 years or so or more that I've been involved. And I think it's going to continue to evolve. If you look at the basic tenets or principles, it's sound management thinking, isn't it? Let's look at our strategy. Let's break it down by these core perspectives that are always going to be important to any business. But where does it go from here? And I know my personal research, I'm interested in a couple of things. The first is, and I don't think anybody would dispute this, strategic windows are getting shorter all the time. Some people would say we live in an era of hyper competition, and of course your competitor could be around the corner or around the globe these days. And so I think organizations are responding to that by having shorter strategic windows. And portfolios of small strategic bets are replacing big, all-in kind of strategic ideas. And so I'm wondering, how is the balanced scorecard going to evolve to face this reality? And I think what we're going to see is shorter and quicker feedback loops and more iteration in performance measurement, and I think the scorecard can lead the way in that. Related to that, I think that we're seeing cultural shifts in organizations now, driven by these attendant strategy changes. Organizations have to be more agile, more nimble today. So I'm very interested in looking at organizational culture and seeing how that applies to a balanced scorecard. So if your culture is changing rapidly, how will that impact or reflect itself on your balanced scorecard? It could get back to how we began this discussion by having more measures in a certain perspective, just again based on cultural fit. So those are some of the questions that I'm personally grappling with, and I think those are some questions that all of us as practitioners and theoreticians are going to have to answer in the days ahead. But what I am confident of is that the balanced scorecard will be there for many years to come to help us answer these questions.
Well, today we've been talking to Paul Niven, the author of the powerful Balanced Scorecard Step-By-Step, Maximizing Performance and Maintaining Results, which is available at Amazon.com, Barnes & Noble, and any number of independent bookstores near you. Paul, again, many thanks for joining us today, and I hope you'll join us again sometime in the not-too-distant future to talk about your more recent books.
Thanks, Robert. The pleasure was mine, and I look forward to joining you again.
That was consultant Paul Niven, the author of the powerful Balanced Scorecard Step-By-Step, Maximizing Performance and Maintaining Results. Please join us for our next episode when we bring you more issues and information on how the CFO and senior corporate finance team can work together to drive rapid and lasting performance. Until then, this is Robert Barnwell and CFO Talk Radio wishing you all the best.
We hope that you have enjoyed this episode and found the material of value. To download a transcript of this episode, receive a free subscription to the show, or to learn more about this subject, we encourage you to visit Professor Barnwell's website at robertgbarnwell.com to explore the many executive briefings, presentations, case studies, and other resources available for immediate download. This has been a production of Robert G. Barnwell. All rights reserved.